He stood in court, his voice shaking, begging the detectives to believe him. But every word he spoke was twisted into a lie. To them, he was already guilty, no matter how many times he pleaded for mercy. His family, once by his side, was pressured to turn away, ashamed of the accusations. Years passed in silence, with his innocence locked away behind bars. Then one journalist refused to let the story die. She dug through sealed files, chasing whispers of forgotten evidence. Inside a dusty folder, buried and ignored, she found a tape, an unheard confession that shattered everything the detective swore was true. The truth was there all along, waiting in the dark. But when that tape finally played, and the words echoed through the courtroom, even the detectives froze. The man they called a liar was innocent. The case would never be the same.
Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.
He stood in the center of the courtroom, not as a man, but as a shadow. His voice shook, his hands trembled, and his eyes searched for even a trace of mercy in the faces around him. He begged the detectives, the jury, the judge, and even his own family to believe him. But every word that left his mouth was twisted into something ugly, something false, something convenient for a story that was already decided. The gavel struck wood, and with it, a sentence was carved into his life. To them, he was guilty before the trial had even begun. His pleas of innocence were not seen as cries for truth, but as manipulations, desperate attempts to escape justice. The detectives had branded him a liar, and that brand burned hotter than iron. It was not a label he could shake. It followed him into every whisper, every headline, every stare. He was led away in chains, his shoulders heavy not just with iron but with the unbearable weight of disbelief. His family trailed behind him, at first whispering that they believed, that they knew the truth. But the whispers faded into silence. The neighbors turned away, friends stopped calling, and eventually even his family was pressured into distance. The shame of association was too much to bear. The trial had ended, but his punishment had only begun. The walls of the prison were not just made of stone. They were built from every person who refused to listen, every detective who dismissed him, every courtroom laugh when he begged for mercy. His truth was sealed away, buried in shadows, ignored like a stain that no one wanted to look at too closely. But truth does not die, even when buried. It lingers, it waits, it scratches at the surface until one day it claws its way back to the light. Inside the evidence archive of the police department, there was a folder, dusty, forgotten, ignored. Its paper edges were brittle, its corners curled with years of neglect. It carried within it a tape, an old recording that no one had ever played in court. A confession whispered into a machine, waiting for ears that cared enough to hear. For years, no one touched it. Detectives dismissed it. Prosecutors overlooked it. Defense attorneys gave up on it. And the man, innocent all along, sat in silence, while his proof of freedom gathered dust. But the silence of the innocent is never truly silent. It screams in the quiet of the night. It rattles in the chains of the guilty. It haunts the conscience of those who buried it. And it waited for someone, anyone, brave, enough to bring it back into the light, that someone would not be a lawyer. It would not be the detectives who condemned him. It would not be his family, who had long since drifted away. It would be a journalist, a single woman who refused to let the story die. She was not famous, she was not powerful, but she was relentless. She had read the court transcripts, she had interviewed the neighbors, and she had walked through the abandoned streets where the crime had taken place. And something about the story did not add up. The timeline was fractured, the witness statements were inconsistent, and the evidence, the very evidence that had been presented in court, felt too neat, too polished, too perfectly stacked against him. It was as if the story had been written first, and then the facts were bent to fit it. She started with a simple request: access to the sealed files. For weeks, she was denied. For weeks, doors slammed in her face. For weeks, officials told her the same thing: there was nothing left to find. But persistence is a kind of key, and eventually, persistence turned the lock. She was led into the records room. Rows upon rows of metal cabinets lined the walls. The air was thick with dust, heavy with the scent of forgotten years. Boxes stacked high, papers crumbling, photographs fading. It was a graveyard of evidence, a place where truth had been left to rot. Her fingers brushed across labels, her eyes scanning numbers, dates, and case names. And then she saw it. A folder, tucked away at the very back of a drawer, marked with the man's name. She pulled it out, coughing as dust clouded the air. She laid it on the table, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside were reports, transcripts, photographs, and at the bottom, beneath everything else, was a tape, a small unmarked cassette. Black plastic, its edges rough with age. She held it up to the light, her reflection faint in its surface. For a moment, she wondered if it was nothing. Another false lead, another dead end in a story filled with them. But then she pressed play. A voice filled the room, not his, another man, calm, steady, but trembling just enough to betray his guilt. The words were quiet but undeniable. It was a confession, a description of the crime. Details that only the real perpetrator could have known. Her heart raced as the voice continued, unraveling the case piece by piece. Everything the detectives had sworn was true now shattered under the weight of those words. This was the evidence they ignored. This was the truth they buried. This was the key that could unlock a man's chains. She sat in silence when the tape ended, the weight of what she had heard pressing down on her chest. She knew what it meant. She knew what it could do. But she also knew what it would cost. To bring this into the light was to go against the system that had buried it. It was to fight the very detectives who had laughed at him in court. Still, the truth demanded a voice, and she was ready to give it one. The folder, the tape, the confession, these were no longer just evidence, they were lifelines, and she would not let them be buried again. But as she packed the folder into her bag, one thought echoed louder than the rest. If this tape existed, how many others had been ignored? How many other men sat in silence, their truth locked away? In forgotten drawers? And if she carried this out of the archive, would she even make it to the courtroom with it? The folder was heavy in her hands, not just with paper and tape, but with the weight of lives. She stepped out of the records room, her heart pounding. The air outside felt colder, sharper, as if the world itself was warning her. Behind her, the drawer she had opened creaked slowly shut. The folder pressed against her chest as she walked out of the records building. To anyone watching, it was nothing more than a collection of paper and an old cassette, the kind of forgotten evidence that had been gathering dust for decades. But to her it felt heavier than steel. Every step she took echoed with the weight of what she carried. This was not just a file. It was the voice of an innocent man, locked away for years, begging to be heard through the silence of another man's confession. She had been in this business long enough to know the dangers of carrying truth in her hands. Truth had a way of making enemies. The detectives who built their careers on his conviction would not want the tape played. The prosecutors who declared the case airtight would not want the folder opened. And the community who had chosen to believe in guilt would not want to admit they had turned away from the wrong man. Yet, here she was, clutching the evidence that could tear down the story everyone accepted. Her breath was steady, but her pulse raced as she slid into her car. She locked the doors, setting the folder carefully on the passenger seat, as if it were fragile glass. The city outside buzzed with ordinary life, people rushing to work, buses honking, children laughing. None of them knew that in this car sat the power to rewrite a man's entire life. The cassette was simple, unmarked, but its voice was etched into her memory. She replayed the words in her mind, the confession whispered with guilt, naming details of the crime that had been absent from the trial. The detectives could dismiss rumors, but they could not dismiss this. The system could bury testimony, but it could not bury a voice forever. Still, she knew she could not simply walk into the courthouse and demand the case be reopened. Evidence, even undeniable evidence, had to claw its way through layers of red tape. Judges, attorneys, and clerks stood as gatekeepers, and each one could decide whether the truth saw light or was buried again. The folder was the key, but she would have to fight to use it. She drove straight to her small office on the edge of town. It was a modest space, lined with boxes of notes, photographs pinned to corkboards, and shelves filled with stories that once began the same way, as whispers, ignored by those in power. She set the folder on her desk, staring at it in silence. This was not just another investigation. This was a man's life. Carefully, she began sorting through the documents inside. The police reports painted a picture of guilt so neatly tied. Together, it almost seemed rehearsed. Witness statements echoed the same words, the same timeline, as if written from a single script. Photographs of evidence showed items that, even to her eye, seemed out of place. A glove with no fingerprints, a door taped shut, but with no fibers on the tape, a knife with blood that had never been properly tested. She saw it all with fresh eyes, and the cracks in the case widened with every page she turned. Then she played the tape again. The confession filled the room, the voice admitting to the crime, trembling but clear. She listened to the details, noting how the man described the layout of the alleyway, the location of the weapon, the sequence of events. These were not the words of someone speculating. They were the words of someone who had been there, someone who had committed the act. Her pen moved furiously across the page as she took notes, circling details that matched the evidence, underlining statements that contradicted the original trial. With each word, the case against the man who sat in prison unraveled further, but then came the hardest question: what next? If she went to the police, the same detectives who once ignored the tape would bury it again. If she went to the court, the clerks would stall, filing motions into endless delays. If she went to the press, she risked the story being twisted before it was ready. Every path forward was blocked, yet she knew she could not keep this folder hidden. The man in prison had waited years for someone to listen. She could not fail him now. She reached for her phone, dialing the number of a defense attorney she trusted. He had once worked on wrongful conviction cases, fighting uphill battles against courts that did not want to admit their mistakes. When he answered, his voice was tired, but sharp. She explained what she had found, her words quick but steady. The silence on the other end was heavy until finally, he spoke. "Bring me the folder. Bring me the tape. If what you say is true, we may have enough to force the court's hand." Her hands tightened around the phone. This was the first step forward, but it was also the most dangerous. To move this evidence into legal hands was to put a target on her back. If the detectives learned she had the tape, they would not hesitate to silence it again. She slid the folder into a protective case and locked it shut. Every instinct told her the next hours would be critical. She gathered her coat, checked the locks on her office door twice, and stepped into the evening air. The sun was fading, shadows stretching across the streets. She drove toward the attorney's office, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. A dark sedan seemed to trail her, keeping its distance but never falling back. Her grip on the wheel tightened. Paranoia or reality, she could not be sure. When she turned left at the next intersection, the sedan turned too. Her heart raced, her breath sharp in her chest. She could not risk losing the folder. She took another turn, and again, the sedan followed. The folder lay beside her, silent but heavy, as if it knew the danger it carried. She pressed her foot down, speeding through the streets, weaving between traffic. The sedan stayed close. By the time she reached the attorney's office, her nerves were frayed, but she forced herself inside. She handed him the case, her hands trembling. He opened it, scanning the reports, then sliding the tape into a player. As the confession filled the room, his expression shifted from skepticism to shock. When the tape ended, the silence between them was heavy. "This changes everything," he said softly. But before she could respond, the lights in the office flickered once, then went dark. The room sank into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, heavy and suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The tape player clicked softly as it wound to a stop, its whirring replaced by the faint hum of electricity fading away. She felt her chest tighten. Power outages were not uncommon, but the timing was too sharp, too precise to ignore. The attorney reached for a flashlight in his desk drawer. Its beam cut across the room in a narrow arc, landing on the folder still open between them. The reports lay scattered, the tape case glinting faintly in the beam of light. He closed the drawer with a quiet thud, his voice low but steady. "This is not coincidence," he said. "Someone knows." Her pulse quickened. She glanced toward the window where the city lights usually spilled in through the blinds. Tonight, they were gone, swallowed by the blackout. Outside, she could make out faint shapes moving in the street. Whether they were pedestrians or something more, she could not tell. The attorney gathered the papers quickly, stacking them back into the folder. He handed it to her, his hands firm. "You keep this with you. If they come for anything, they will come for me first. You cannot let this disappear again." His words hit hard. She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The folder had survived years in a locked drawer, buried under indifference and neglect. To lose it now after she had found the voice inside the tape would mean burying the truth forever. She slid the folder back into her case, snapping the lock shut. Her fingers trembled as she did it. The attorney lit a second flashlight, pressing it into her hand. "Get home safe. Do not trust anyone tonight, not even those who claim they are here to help." The building's stairwell echoed as she descended, her footsteps too loud in the hollow dark. Outside, the blackout stretched across the street, swallowing entire blocks. Streetlights that once glowed stood cold and dead, traffic lights frozen in silence. Cars sat abandoned mid-intersection, their drivers stepping out with phones in their hands, searching for signal. She pulled her coat tight, clutching the case against her body, as if shielding it with her own breath. Her car was parked just ahead. The sedan from before was gone, but that did not ease the tension wrapping around her ribs. She knew better than to think shadows ever truly disappeared. They simply changed their shape. Sliding into her car, she locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights pierced the dark, cutting through the abandoned street. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The folder was safe. The tape was safe. Tomorrow, the attorney would begin filing motions. Tomorrow, the truth could finally be heard in a courtroom. But as she turned the wheel, her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights flared to life half a block behind her. The road was nearly empty, yet the car trailed her, steady and quiet. She took one turn, then another, each time checking the mirror. The headlights followed. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was no coincidence. The folder shifted slightly on the seat beside her as if reminding her why. She was being followed. She pressed her foot harder on the accelerator, weaving through empty streets, the glow of her headlights bouncing off shuttered windows and darkened storefronts. The trailing car never slowed. She cut right sharply, tires screeching, but the headlights swung in behind her, unwavering. A cold shiver crawled up her spine. Whoever was behind her was not giving up. Her mind raced. If she led them to her home, she would be trapped. If she went back to the attorney's office, she might endanger him further. She needed somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere they would not expect. She drove toward the edge of town, the streets narrowing into quieter roads. The headlights followed. She could almost feel their gaze pressing against her back. Then, in the distance, she saw it, a faded sign pointing toward an old library, closed years ago but still standing. She turned sharply down the road, pulling into the lot behind it. The car behind her slowed as it approached the corner, for a long moment. Its headlights lit the street outside the library. Then they turned away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Her breath came out in a sharp rush, her hands shaking against the wheel. She had lost them. For now. She sat in the car, staring at the dark shape of the abandoned library. The building loomed against the night sky, its windows shattered, its walls stained with time. It was not safety, not truly, but it was shelter. She clutched the case and stepped out, her flashlight beam cutting through the hollow air. Inside, the library smelled of dust and damp wood. Shelves leaned at crooked angles, their books long since stripped away. Papers littered the floor like forgotten whispers. She moved through the aisles, her footsteps crunching softly, until she reached the old reading room at the back. She sat at a table, placing the folder in front of her. For a moment, she let her hands rest on it, steadying herself. The silence of the room pressed close, broken only by the faint creak of the building settling in the wind. She opened the folder again, scanning the reports, the photographs, the details. Each page screamed of negligence, of truth ignored. The taped confession was not just evidence. It was a crack in the wall of lies, a spark that could ignite everything. But as she sat in the hollow silence of the library, she realized something chilling. If the tape existed, if it had survived all these years, someone had chosen to keep it hidden. Someone powerful enough to decide which truths lived and which truths died, and that someone would not stop now. She closed the folder, sliding it back into her case, and leaned against the table. Her flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the wind howled through broken windows. Then, from somewhere deep inside the library, a floorboard creaked. The sound was faint, but it did not belong to the wind. A floorboard creaking in a building abandoned for years meant only one thing. She was not alone. Her hand froze on the table, the flashlight beam trembling slightly as she raised it toward the sound. Dust drifted lazily in the cone of light, but the far end of the room remained swallowed in shadow. She pressed her palm flat against the folder, grounding herself against panic. The folder was more than paper now. It was a lifeline, a chain, to the man sitting in prison, a chain to justice itself. She knew she could not leave it behind. She slid the folder back into her case and locked it shut, every click of the latch sounding louder than it should. The floor creaked again, closer this time. A deliberate step, slow and patient, as though whoever moved in the dark knew exactly how to make fear grow with each sound. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned off her flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. Silence fell, except for the faint moan of the wind through broken windows. She crouched low, moving along the edge of the table, her hand gripping the case tightly. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She tried to listen, tried to separate her fear from the real sounds around her. And then she heard it, a faint scraping, like a hand brushing along a wall. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew if she bolted blindly into the dark, she would make herself a target. She forced herself to move slowly, quietly, edging toward the far corner of the reading room. Her fingers brushed against a tall shelf, its wood splintered and warped. She pressed her back against it, steadying her breath, every muscle tense. The air shifted, a faint draft carrying the smell of old paper and damp wood. Then the silence was broken by a voice, low and calm. "You should not be here." The words slid across the dark like a blade. She froze, her pulse hammering in her throat. The voice was steady, but heavy with warning. It was not a shout. It was not a threat screamed in anger. It was quieter, more dangerous, as though whoever spoke knew they were in control. She gripped the case tighter. "Who are you?" she asked, her own voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. No answer, only the sound of another step, closer now. The wooden floor groaned beneath the weight. She flicked her flashlight back on, sweeping the beam across the room. For a split second, it caught a figure at the edge of the shadows, a man in a dark coat, his face obscured. Then the beam quivered, and he was gone again, swallowed by the dark. She backed toward the far exit, her beam darting frantically. "Stay back," she said, her voice cracking, though she knew words carried no power here. The man's voice came again, soft and sharp. "You do not understand what you are holding." Her breath hitched. "I understand enough," she said, forcing the words out, her hands trembling. "I know it proves he is innocent. I know it was buried." Silence. Then, a low chuckle that seemed to echo in the hollow space. "You think one tape changes everything? You think one folder makes the truth?" Her flashlight beam landed on the far wall, catching the faint outline of another door, a way out. She tightened her grip on the case and bolted toward it, her footsteps thundering across the floor. Behind her, the sound of pursuit exploded. The man moving faster now, his footsteps heavy, closing in. She shoved the door open, stumbling into a narrow hallway lined with broken shelves. Her flashlight swung wildly as she ran, the beam catching. Fragments of old books, torn pages fluttering like dying leaves. The hall twisted, each step echoing louder than the last. She reached another door, this one half broken, its frame splintered. She shoved it open and burst into a stairwell. The steps spiraled down into darkness, but she had no choice. She ran, her hand sliding along the cold railing, her flashlight bouncing with each step. At the bottom, she pushed through another door and found herself in the basement of the library. The air was damp and stale, the walls lined with old filing. Cabinets. Her flashlight cut across the room, catching dust particles drifting in the heavy air. She pressed her back against one of the cabinets, clutching the case tight. Her chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. The silence returned, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. Then the footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the basement. Her eyes darted around the room, filing cabinets stretched in rows, their drawers slightly open, papers spilling out. A maze of metal and shadows. She moved into the rows, her footsteps muffled against the damp floor. She ducked low, weaving between cabinets, her flashlight dimmed with her hand to keep its glow faint. The man's voice carried again, calm but sharp. "You should not dig into things that were meant to stay buried." Her teeth clenched. "That tape is the truth. You buried it, not me." Silence followed, but she could hear his footsteps moving closer through the maze. She crouched, low, clutching the folder to her chest. She knew she could not fight him. Her only chance was to escape, to keep the folder safe. Her flashlight beam caught something ahead, a small metal door near the floor, a maintenance hatch half hidden behind a cabinet. Her heart leapt. She crawled toward it, her hands shaking, as she tugged it open. Cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of soil and damp earth. She squeezed through the hatch, dragging the folder case behind her. The space beyond was narrow, a service tunnel lined with pipes, stretching into darkness. She pulled the hatch shut behind her, her breath loud in the silence. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. The tunnel was damp, the air heavy, but it was a way out. She moved forward, her knees scraping against the ground, the folder case dragging with her. Then, from behind the hatch, came a single sound, a hand slamming against the metal, hard enough to rattle the frame. The noise echoed through the tunnel, vibrating in her bones. She froze, Her breath caught in her throat. The hand struck again, harder this time. Metal groaned. And then a whisper slid through the crack, barely audible, but sharp as glass. "You will not make it out." The hatch shuddered behind her, and the sound crawled down the pipe like a living thing. Metal rang once, then settled into a long groan that trembled in her teeth. She held the case tight to her chest and listened for the second strike that would mean the hinge was giving way. It came softer than the first, yet closer, a promise that the dark on the other side was not done with her. The service tunnel pressed in from all directions. The ceiling sweated, and the concrete smelled of iron and old storms. Her flashlight painted a thin ribbon over pipes marked with faded arrows and chipped paint. Red valve wheels crouched along the wall like staring eyes, and a strip of yellow. Tape hung from one joint, frayed to threads that stirred in the stale air. She crawled sideways to keep the case away from the wet floor and counted breaths because counting made panic turn into something she could carry. Behind her, the hatch rattled again, and this time the sound was joined by a quick scrape, as if a tool probed the edge. If the lock was weak, then the next sound would be a rush of boots and a flood of cold air at her back. She dragged the case past a junction where the tunnel split. The left branch dipped toward a low grate that hummed faintly with running water. The right rose toward a darker bend that held almost no sound at all. Water meant noise, and noise could hide footsteps. Silence meant a trap. She turned left and kept her knees high to spare the case another scrape across the concrete. The grate sang in a thin voice. She reached it and found a narrow catwalk that crossed a culvert no wider than a coffin. The water below moved like black glass and carried broken leaves that spun in small circles, then vanished through a mouth in the stone. Her light found a maintenance stencil on the far wall. The letters were ghost pale under dust. She read them slowly in her head to keep the rhythm steady and to remind herself that systems have maps and maps can be learned. A city hides many faces, but its bones never lie. She edged along the catwalk with her back to the wall. The case bumped against pipe clamps and the latches clicked once in protest. The sound was small, yet it shook her more than the hatch had. She paused and checked. Each clasp by touch. Both were shut and flat. She breathed once into her sleeve to warm the sting in her chest and moved again, 1 foot at a time, counting 3 beats per step so she did not rush and fall. Beyond the culvert, the tunnel widened low enough to force a crawl. Gray dust lay thick over the floor, except for a fresh smear where something heavy had been dragged. She touched the mark and felt grit grind under her fingers. It pointed toward a bend where the tunnel bellied down and narrowed. That meant someone else had used this path not long ago. It meant she was not the first to choose water over silence. She killed the flashlight and let her eyes adjust to the weak glow that seeped from a vent ahead. In the dim, she could see a ladder crusted with rust and a valve wheel tied with a strip of red evidence tape. The tape fluttered as if a breath passed the joint. Evidence tape here did not make sense. Someone had come down from the world above and tried to mark a control as off-limits. That meant an earlier repair, or a secret no one wanted touched. Either way, it meant stories buried twice. She turned the light back on and kept it low. The ladder groaned under her weight and shook flakes over the water. She climbed only 3 rungs to reach the vent and peered through the grid. Beyond it lay a crawl space and a faint rectangle of streetlight like a postage stamp on stone. She set the case on the ladder shelf made by the 3rd rung and pressed her ear to the vent. The city thrummed on the far side at a distance that felt both safe and unreachable. A cold gust ran the length of the pipe behind her. The hatch had opened. She did not hear boots yet, but air moved with the speed of pursuit. She slipped back down the ladder and hugged the case under one arm. The culvert path continued into a curve that narrowed into black. She moved, and the case knocked the wall. One clasp chirped against metal, and she winced at the sound. The curve emptied into a chamber tall enough to stand in. Old cables looped, down like vines. A locker leaned open against the wall, its door bent and its shelves stuttering out like a broken jaw. Inside lay a plastic sleeve of work orders curled with age, a coil of nylon rope, and a single blue nitrile glove stiff with dust. She took the glove and slid it into her coat pocket without thinking why. A symbol of care left behind still felt better than empty hands. She opened the work orders and scanned dates. They were years old. The job codes listed pump tests and gate inspections, and one line flagged in red pencil that read, "Keep lower vault sealed." She folded the page and traced the arrow drawn by the same hand. It pointed to a hatch on the floor with a wheel handle set flush to the plate. Someone had marked the wheel with a paint slash as if to tell which way was safe. Paint fades. Memory lies. She knelt and put her ear to the plate. She heard only the deep sleep of ground. Bootsteps whispered from the far curve of the tunnel and stopped. The sound became breath. It was not close, but it was patient. She turned the wheel slowly and felt it resist, then loosen as if a weight had shifted below. She lifted the hatch just high enough to see a black well that smelled of riverstone. The drop was not far. The floor below held a narrow ledge and another tunnel that bent toward the heart of the city. She lowered the case first, then dropped after it, and landed on the ledge with a jolt that rattled her teeth. Her knee flared with heat. She killed the light again and held still. Above her, the bootsteps returned and circled the chamber once. Metal sang as a hand brushed cable. A quiet voice spoke a single word that she could not catch. Then silence, again as if the dark had swallowed its maker. She moved along the lower tunnel with one hand on the wall and one on the case. The stone wept a fine sheet of moisture that soaked her sleeve. Pipes hummed overhead. A low roar rose ahead that could be traffic or water. The roar grew into a steady rush, and the tunnel mouth opened into a spillway where a runoff channel shot, passed like muscle. A concrete lip bridged it, and an iron door waited beyond, chained with a padlock that had eaten a lifetime of rain. She set the case down and tested the chain. The links were stiff, but the anchor bolt on one side had no nut. The plate wobbled a hair. She worked her fingers behind it and pulled until skin burned. It shifted a breath, then held. She took the nylon rope from the locker, looped it around the plate, and leaned with all her weight. Metal squealed, and the bolt slid free in a shower of grit. The chain sagged, and she slipped the loop aside and hauled the door inward on screaming hinges. On the other side lay a brick utility corridor that smelled like damp paper and copper. Stenciled arrows pointed toward a word that made her knees go weak. Courthouse. She had stumbled into the veins that fed the building where verdicts were spoken, as if the city wanted to give her one more chance to carry truth to daylight. Once the shock eased, she pushed forward with the case pressed to her ribs. The corridor climbed in slow steps. On the walls were chalk notes smeared by hands that had worked in haste. One note circled a valve and wrote, "Do not shut." Another underlined a panel and wrote alarm to street. She moved past each warning with care. The blackout had left the alarms mute, but caution kept her alive long before any wire did. Above her, the rush of the city returned in a softer tone as if filtered through stone. The corridor ended at a steel service door with a push bar and a small wired window that showed only darkness. She wiped grime from the glass with her sleeve and saw a basement hallway lined with old archive cabinets and a single exit sign that glowed on a dying battery. She pushed the bar and the door answered with a tired shove. The hallway air was cool and tasted of paper and bleach. She stepped inside and shut the door quietly. The courthouse basement stretched in both directions with no sound but the soft tick of emergency lights. She moved toward the archives because that was where her proof belonged and because a locked cabinet can hide a miracle for one more hour if needed. The case grew heavier with each step, as if the folder had learned what it was about to do and wanted to test her will. She found a room marked records and slid inside. Rows of cabinets stood like soldiers at rest, each drawer labeled in small type. The room smelled of cardboard and toner and the strange sweetness of old glue. A copier sat asleep in the corner with its status light a stubborn green. Even in a blackout, some machines keep one eye open. She set the case on the table and checked the room twice. No cameras winked. No feet whispered. No breath waited. Her hands shook as she opened the case. She told herself to work slow and clean. She would scan the confession and the key reports. She would create copies that no one could bury. She pictured the tape feeding a line of sound into a digital memory that the city could not choke. She pictured a file that would become a lighthouse for a man who had learned to live in night. She lifted the folder out and set it beside the copier. The paper edges were soft and furred. She tried to breathe with patience so her fingers would not tear what time already had thinned. She reached for the cassette case to make one more recording on her phone in case she found a machine later. Her hand met the slot where the cassette should have been. It was empty. For a heartbeat, she thought the case flap had folded wrong. She checked the side pocket, then the other. The small plastic rectangle that had carried another man's voice was not there. The latches on the case were still shut and flat. The zipper was still kissed tight at the corner. The space where the tape had ridden since the records room felt like a pulled tooth. She closed her eyes and ran back through each moment as if memory had become a map she could follow. The first click when the case bumped a clamp. The second click on the catwalk. The jolt when she dropped to the lower ledge. Each small sound returned like a marker on a trail she had walked in fear and focus. One of them had been the stitch that came undone. She emptied the folder on the table and searched for the cassette, as if it might have slid between reports. She lifted photographs and shook sleeves and turned the case upside down. The copier, watched with its green eye and the exit sign, kept breathing in the hall. Paper whispered. The plastic did not answer. Her phone vibrated once inside her coat, then fell silent. Unknown caller in a city without power. A single ring like a tap on glass. She stared at the dark screen and felt the room shrink around her ribs. The line had found her even when the lights had not. Someone else was in the courthouse shadows. Someone else knew what the empty space in her case now meant. The tape was gone. The small black rectangle that carried the voice of guilt had vanished from her case, leaving behind nothing but the empty pocket where it had rested. She stared at the absence as though sheer willpower might make it return. But there was no mistaking it. Somewhere between the tunnels and the courthouse basement, the tape had slipped into shadows, or been taken. For a long moment, she could not move. The folder was still here, the report still intact, the photographs still damning in their inconsistencies. Yet without the tape, the heart of the evidence felt torn out. She leaned on the table, her breath sharp, her fingers trembling across the scattered pages. But then she remembered something. She had listened to the tape not once, but many times. She had written notes, careful notes, circling every detail the voice gave. Those notes were in her folder, in her own handwriting, with cross-references to the case files. The tape might be gone, but its ghost remained inked across her pages. She gathered herself, sliding the papers back into order. Fear had taken the tape, but fear would not take the truth. She placed the folder back into her case, shut it tight, and left the records room. The courthouse was silent in the blackout, the hallways lit only by dim emergency signs. Each step echoed like a gavel in the empty corridors. When she reached the attorney's office upstairs, he was waiting with candles set along his desk. The light cast his face in sharp lines. His eyes narrowed when he saw her expression. "You lost it," he said quietly. Not an accusation, a statement. She set the case on the table and opened it, spreading her notes before him. "The tape is gone," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "But I wrote everything down, every word, every detail. We can still fight." He scanned the notes, his jaw tightening. Then, slowly, he nodded. "It is enough," he said. Not perfect, but enough. Courts run on words, and you have them here. That night bled into dawn, the courthouse still flickering under partial power. Word spread quickly of what had been found, and the motion to reopen the case was filed before the sun rose. Judges balked, clerks muttered about missing procedures, but the folder moved forward like a storm breaking through gates. By noon, a hearing was scheduled. The man sat in chains once again, led into the courtroom with the same shuffle of iron he had carried for years. But this time, the air was different. The whispers in the gallery did not carry the same certainty of guilt. People leaned forward, curious, unsettled. The detectives who had once laughed at him now sat stiffly in the back row, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. The attorney rose, the folder in his hands. He laid it gently on the table, as though it were something sacred. He began to speak, not of technicalities, not of loopholes, but of human truth. He read from the police reports, pointing to contradictions. He held up the photographs, showing evidence mishandled. And finally, he unfolded the journalist's notes. He read aloud the confession, word for word, as it had been transcribed. The courtroom fell into silence as the voice of guilt, though now spoken by another, filled the air. Every detail was precise, every admission undeniable. The jury from years ago had never heard these words. The judge from years ago had never considered them. And the detectives who sat at the back shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to the floor. The man who had begged for mercy sat still, his hands folded, his eyes wet with something between hope and fear. He had lived so long in chains that even freedom, when offered, felt like a dream he dared not touch. When the attorney finished reading, the silence was so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Then the judge leaned forward, his voice steady, but carrying weight. The court recognizes this evidence as material, credible, and previously suppressed. The conviction is overturned. The gavel struck wood, and the sound cracked like thunder through the chamber. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the chains were unlocked, falling from his wrists to the floor with a hollow clang. The man stood slowly, as though afraid the ground might vanish beneath him. He looked toward the gallery, but no one met his gaze. Neighbors who had once whispered guilty now turned their eyes away in shame. The journalist watched from her bench, her chest tight. She wanted to cheer, to cry, to shout that the truth had finally spoken, but the weight of years stolen hung heavy over the victory. Innocence proved did not erase nights spent in a cell, did not erase the moments lost with family, did not erase the silence he had been forced to carry. He walked free, but not whole. Freedom had come, but justice had been late. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. He said nothing. His voice had been ignored too long, and he had no words left to give them. He simply walked into the sunlight, blinking against its glare, the air fresh and foreign after so many years in darkness. The journalist stood at the steps, the folder still clutched to her chest. She knew what it had cost to bring it here, what shadows had followed her through tunnels and streets. The tape was gone, but the truth had survived without it. For once, the silence had been broken. The detectives slipped away quietly, their careers cracked by the weight of what they had ignored. The community watched in uneasy silence, confronted by their own betrayal. The judge closed his book, the gavel resting silent at last. The man paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps, looking back only once. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the years of disbelief, the nights of begging, the laughter of those who had called him a liar, all of it burned in that single look. And then he turned away, walking into a future both free and haunted. She exhaled slowly, the folder pressed against her ribs. For now it was over. But the thought gnawed at her as the crowd scattered, and the cameras packed away. How many other folders still sat in forgotten drawers? How many other voices still whispered unheard in the dark? She knew this was not the end. It was only one truth among many, dragged into the light. And as long as those shadows existed, she would keep searching. Because truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again.
What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Click here to watch the next video as we uncover another thrilling crime case.